Holmes staged a comeback in 1903. An American magazine offered Doyle the staggering sum of $25,000 for 6 stories about the great detective. But there was a catch. They couldn't be retrospective. Holmes had to literally come back to life. Hence that wonderful piece of nonsense, The Adventure of the Empty House, in which Sherlock tells dear, credulous Watson that he escaped from Moriarty using rare Japanese unarmed combat techniques, swarmed up the cliff to elude his pursuers, and spent the intervening time wandering around the world, winding up in, of course, Tibet with, of course, the Dalai Lama.
Are you sure you are really fit to discuss things? I've given you a serious shock by my unnecessarily dramatic reappearance. I am all right, but indeed, Holmes, I can hardly believe my eyes. Good heavens! To think that you of all men, should be standing in my study.
Doyle's fantasy life was sensationally rich. He lived in a world of strong, noble men and beautiful, chaste women. I'm standing in front of some of the stained glass windows he put up here at Undershaw, a tribute, I suppose, to his mother's obsession with medieval heraldry and the distinguished origins of her own family. But there's evidence to suggest things were a little more complicated than that. Louise, his first wife, died in 1906, but while he was still living with her in this house, he met and fell in love with a young woman called Jean Leckie. Doyle liked to present this affair as a matter of base impulses proudly suppressed, but it may well have been a little bit more complicated than that. And until we've had access to all his correspondence, we won't know the answer. The fact is that his later years are really the story of a man backed into a corner by his own celebrity. Known against his will as the man who created Sherlock Holmes, he embarked on a public career as Gothic as anything in the experience of his great detective.
This may look like a cathedral, but in fact, I'm in the Royal Courts of Justice, just off the Strand. How do you tell if a person is what they pretend to be? How do you find out if someone is lying or if they're telling the truth? What, after you've stripped away poses, disguises, attitudes, locations, is the essence of an individual?
It was P.G. Wodehouse who pointed out that Conan Doyle actually said things like, "Aha, there is villainy afoot." Did he talk like Sherlock Holmes, or did Sherlock Holmes talk like him? There's no doubt that, towards the end of his life, he started to sound more and more like his own creation. In 1906, he played the detective for real in the Idalgi case. Idalgi was a young man of Parsi origin who'd been accused of the bizarre offence of disemboweling ponies. Doyle was able to show that not only was he too physically slight to have done such a thing, he was also severely myopic and couldn't possibly have found his way across a dark field to commit the unspeakable offence. You name the cause, Doyle signed up for it. Home rule for Ireland, he was against it. The Boer War, he was for it. Divorce law reform, well, Doyle was no feminist. His passion for all these causes was genuine and one of the most attractive things about him, but he threw himself into them with a theatrical intensity.
Barristers, policemen, soldiers, they all have their uniforms. Doyle had one for almost every day of the week. And some of them he designed himself.
Clothing his fantasies in reality was a fundamental need for Doyle. He publicly announced his conversion to spiritualism in 1916.
This tragically touched-up photograph contains a portrait of his son, who died of influenza just after the end of the First War. In this very early footage of a séance, the woman sitting second from the right is Doyle's second wife, Jean Leckie.
Brothers, we have met today to give the true meaning of this cooperation of the two worlds. It is not a matter of faith, but of fact. It is not only a matter of belief, but it is of knowledge.
He was keen to keep up with the spirit world using all the latest technology. Although, as we shall see from this next clip, the sound system wasn't always up to scratch.
There must be the abolition of war. There must be that love and friendliness with all nations. In the time that is to come, national life must cease. There must be that
I'm at a séance conducted by the British Reformed Spiritualist Association in West London.
Over there, sitting at the head of the table, is a medium called John Sayles. He claims to have regular conversations with the late Sir Arthur.
Conan Doyle once said there would be whiskey and cigars on the other side, but it's almost too easy to mock the faith that sustained him after the death of his son. The eccentricity is part of his magic as a writer. Doyle was one of those rare, marvellous authors who could believe 6 impossible things before breakfast. And what I love about his work is its unashamed trickery, the feeling that you're never quite sure how to take all this.
There is, as it happens, no such organisation as the British Reformed Spiritualist Association, and if there is a medium called John Sayles, then I am not intended to be him. Disguise. Sherlock Holmes and Conan Doyle are all about disguise.
Holmes? Is it really you?
Holmes! How are you, my dear fellow? A fine detective.
Can it indeed be that you are alive? Is it possible that you succeeded in climbing out of that awful abyss?
Sherlock Holmes once said that it is one of the first qualities of a criminal investigator that he should be able to see through a disguise. But if we've cheated you, it was simply to illustrate the fact that though we may think the detective story is about logical thought, in fact, as Conan Doyle knew all too well, the cards are all in the narrator's hands.
People ask me, will I write any more Sherlock Holmes stories? I certainly don't think it's at all probable. But as I grow older, the psychic subject always grows in intensity, and then one becomes more earnest upon it, and I should think that my few remaining years will probably be devoted much more in that direction than in the direction of literature.
Doyle died on the 7th of July 1930, here at Crowborough in Sussex. True to his spiritualist beliefs, there was no mourning. In fact, 3 days after he died, they gave a garden party to celebrate his crossing over to the other side. He was buried in the garden, a bit like the family budgie. Later on, his family kept in touch, as they say in spiritualist circles. In fact, he had conversations with a surprisingly large number of people after he died, including the well-known psychic Hannon Swaffer, of whom it was famously written, "Now that Sir Arthur's had the run of all the pleasures space can offer, can we conclude they're not much fun since he comes back to talk to Swaffer?" But in the 50s, when this house was sold, they dug him up. And this is where he ended up, in the village churchyard at Minstead in the New Forest.
In fiction and spiritualism, people come back to life, to order. Holmes not only survived, he outlived and outlasted his creator. He was to be a hard act to follow.